In the final days of World War II, the Pacific Ocean held a secret. Beneath its waves lurked the most extraordinary submarines ever constructed. These were not ordinary vessels. They were underwater aircraft carriers, massive ships designed to launch bomber attacks against the American mainland. Their capture in August 1945 revealed one of Japan's most ambitious war plans. This is the story of the I-400 class submarines, the largest submarines in the world for decades after their construction. To understand these remarkable vessels, we must first understand their origins. By 1942, Japan's situation in the Pacific War was beginning to deteriorate. The victories at Pearl Harbor and across Southeast Asia seemed distant memories. American industrial might was beginning to turn the tide of the conflict. Japanese military planners were desperately seeking ways to strike back at America. Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto, architect of the Pearl Harbor attack, had a bold vision. He proposed creating submarines capable of attacking the United States directly. Not just coastal targets, but strategic infrastructure deep inside America. The concept was audacious: submarines that could carry bomber aircraft. These aircraft would be launched at sea, attack targets on land, then return. The submarines would operate independently, striking fear into the American heartland. In January 1942, Yamamoto ordered the design of these extraordinary vessels. The specifications were unprecedented in submarine construction. Each submarine would be over 400 feet long, making them true underwater giants. They would displace 5,700 tons submerged, larger than many surface warships. Most remarkably, each submarine would carry 3 Aichi M6A Seirin bombers. These aircraft were specifically designed for submarine operations. The submarines would also carry torpedoes, making them formidable in naval combat. Japanese engineers faced enormous technical challenges in this design. How do you store aircraft inside a submarine and keep them operational? How do you launch them at sea quickly enough to avoid detection? And how do you create a submarine large enough to carry all this equipment? The solution was a watertight hangar built into the submarine's hull. This hangar was cylindrical, running along the top of the submarine's pressure hull. It was 102 feet long and 11 feet in diameter, large enough for 3 aircraft. The hangar door opened along its length, allowing aircraft to be rolled out. A compressed air catapult was mounted on the forward deck for launching. The entire system could launch all 3 aircraft in less than 30 minutes. This was revolutionary technology that pushed submarine design to its limits. Construction of the I-400 class began in January 1943 at Kure Naval Arsenal. The original plan called for 18 of these massive submarines. This fleet would have posed a significant strategic threat to the United States. Imagine 54 bombers capable of striking anywhere on the American coast. They could attack ports, shipyards, factories, even cities. The psychological impact alone would have been devastating. However, the realities of wartime production intervened. Building these submarines required enormous resources and specialized labor. Japan's industrial capacity was already stretched thin by 1943. American submarines were strangling Japan's supply lines across the Pacific. Raw materials became increasingly scarce as the war continued. The submarine construction program was scaled back repeatedly, first to 9 submarines, then to 5, and finally to just 3. Only 3 I-400 class submarines would ever be completed. These were designated I-400, I-401, and I-402. Each took over a year to build due to their complexity. I-400 was commissioned on December 30, 1944. I-401 followed on January 8, 1945. I-402 was completed in July 1945, just weeks before the war ended. By the time these submarines were operational, Japan's situation was desperate. The Imperial Navy had been decimated in battles across the Pacific. American forces were closing in on the Japanese home islands, but the I-400 submarines represented a final hope for a strategic blow. The Aichi M6A Seirin aircraft were equally remarkable machines. The name Seirin means mountain haze, reflecting their stealth mission. These were single-engine float planes, designed for one-way bombing missions. Each could carry an 800-pound bomb or a torpedo. The aircraft featured folding wings and a removable tail to fit in the hangar. Float assemblies could be quickly attached before launch. For suicide missions, the floats could be removed to increase speed and range. The Seirin had a top speed of 295 miles per hour. Its range was approximately 740 miles, with a full bomb load. This meant the submarines could launch attacks from hundreds of miles offshore. The pilots trained for these missions knew they were unlikely to return. Landing at sea near the submarine was extremely difficult. Most missions were planned as one-way attacks, with pilots ditching near land, or in the final desperate months crashing into their targets. The combination of submarine and aircraft created unique tactical possibilities. The submarines could approach targets with complete stealth. Surface ships and reconnaissance aircraft would never detect them. Once in position, they could launch strikes with minimal warning. The aircraft would appear suddenly, attack, and the submarine would disappear. American defenses would have great difficulty responding to such tactics. Several targets were considered for these submarine bomber attacks. The Panama Canal was a high-priority objective. Destroying the canal locks would cripple American logistics between oceans. Ships would have to sail around South America, adding weeks to transit times. This would significantly hamper the American war effort in the Pacific. San Francisco and Los Angeles were also potential targets. Attacks on these cities would terrify the American civilian population. Naval bases at San Diego and Pearl Harbor were considered vulnerable. New York City was theoretically within range if the submarines refueled. The psychological impact of bombing American cities would be enormous. Americans had felt secure behind the vast Pacific Ocean. Attacks on the mainland would shatter that sense of invulnerability. However, the military effectiveness of these attacks was questionable. 9 aircraft carrying 1,800-pound bombs could not cause massive destruction. Even against the Panama Canal, success was far from guaranteed. The canal's locks were heavily defended and difficult targets. American fighters would scramble to intercept the slow-moving Siren bombers, but the Japanese High Command was desperate for any way to strike back. By mid-1945, the I-400 submarines were finally ready for combat operations. Captain Tatsunoki Ariazumi commanded I-401. He was an experienced submarine officer with a reputation for aggression. Commander Shinsei Nambu commanded I-400. Both men understood the significance of their mission. The submarines underwent extensive trials and training exercises. Launching aircraft from a submarine was a complex and dangerous operation. The crew had to surface, open the hangar, assemble and launch 3 aircraft, all while remaining vulnerable to enemy detection and attack. The submarines practiced these procedures until they could do them efficiently. But time was running out for Japan. In March 1945, American forces landed on Iwo Jima. In April, they invaded Okinawa, bringing the war to Japan's doorstep. American bombers were now regularly attacking Japanese cities. Hundreds of B-29 superfortresses dropped incendiary bombs nightly. Tokyo, Osaka, and dozens of other cities were being systematically destroyed. The Imperial Navy was a shadow of its former strength. Most of Japan's aircraft carriers and battleships had been sunk. Fuel shortages meant that even surviving ships often couldn't leave port. In this desperate situation, the I-400 submarines represented a final gamble. The original plan to attack the Panama Canal was still under consideration, but logistics made this mission increasingly difficult. The submarines would have to travel thousands of miles to reach the canal. American anti-submarine forces controlled much of the Pacific. The chances of all submarines reaching their target were slim. In July 1945, the mission was changed to a more achievable objective. The submarines would attack American naval forces at Ulithi Atoll. Ulithi was a major American fleet anchorage in the Caroline Islands. Hundreds of American warships used this base for replenishment and repairs. A successful attack could damage multiple ships and disrupt American operations. The mission was codenamed Operation Hikari, meaning light. I-400 and I-401 would participate, along with I-13 and I-14. I-13 and I-14 were smaller submarines, each carrying 2 Siren aircraft. Together, the submarine force would launch 10 bombers against Ulithi. The attack was scheduled for August 17, 1945. The submarines departed from Ominato Naval Base in northern Japan. I-400 left on July 23, followed by I-401 on July 26. The crews were in high spirits, despite the desperate military situation. They believed their mission could strike a significant blow against America. The submarines traveled separately to avoid detection, They would rendezvous at sea before the final approach to Ulithi. The journey south took them through waters heavily patrolled by American forces. The submarine crews maintained strict radio silence. They traveled mostly submerged, surfacing only to recharge batteries. Life aboard the I-400 class submarines was cramped despite their size. Each submarine carried a crew of 144 officers and men. The aircraft pilots and maintenance crew added to the crowding. Conditions were hot and humid inside the pressure hull. The air conditioning system struggled to keep the interior comfortable. Fresh water was limited, and bathing was a rare luxury. Food was adequate but monotonous, mostly rice and canned fish. The crew slept in shifts, hot bunking to conserve space. Despite these hardships, morale remained relatively high. The men believed they were undertaking a mission of historic importance. But events far beyond their control were about to overtake them. On August 6, 1945, an American B-29 dropped an atomic bomb on Hiroshima. The city was obliterated in an instant, with over 100,000 casualties. The submarines at sea had no knowledge of this catastrophic event. They continued their mission, unaware that the world had changed forever. On August 9th, a second atomic bomb destroyed Nagasaki. That same day, the Soviet Union declared war on Japan and invaded Manchuria. Japan's military leadership realized the war was truly lost. On August 15th, Emperor Hirohito made a radio broadcast to the nation. In his high, thin voice, he announced Japan's unconditional surrender. For the first time in history, most Japanese heard their emperor's voice. The broadcast was intentionally vague, speaking of enduring the unendurable. But the meaning was clear. The war was over and Japan had been defeated. Radio messages were sent to all Japanese military units, ordering them to cease hostilities. The I-400 submarines received these messages while still at sea. The crews were stunned and confused by the news. Some officers argued they should continue the mission regardless. Captain Ariazumi of I-401 was particularly resistant to surrendering. He had a fierce warrior spirit and found the idea of surrender intolerable. But the explicit orders from Naval High Command left no room for interpretation. All submarines were ordered to surface, jettison their weapons, and await instructions. This was one of the most difficult moments in the history of the Imperial Navy. The submarine crews had been raised in a culture that valued honor above life. Surrender was considered the ultimate disgrace, yet they were being ordered to surrender by the Emperor himself. Disobeying the Emperor was unthinkable in Japanese military culture. The commanders of the I-400 submarines faced an agonizing decision. On August 16th, the day after the surrender announcement, the submarines surfaced and prepared to comply with orders. The first step was to destroy the sarin aircraft. The crews opened the hangars and brought the aircraft onto the deck. These magnificent machines, built at such cost and effort, were now worthless. The wings were removed and the aircraft were pushed overboard. They sank into the Pacific, taking with them Japan's last hope for strategic bombing. Torpedoes were fired with their warheads removed, rendering them harmless. All ammunition was thrown overboard. The catapult systems were disabled to prevent their use. It was heartbreaking work for the crews who had trained so hard for combat. But the alternative was to disobey the Emperor, which was unthinkable. Captain Ariazumi of I-401 struggled profoundly with the surrender order. After overseeing the destruction of his submarine's weapons, he gathered his personal effects and said farewell to his crew. He then went to his cabin and locked the door. Shortly afterward, a single gunshot was heard. Ariazumi had committed suicide rather than face the shame of surrender. His body was given a burial at sea with full military honors. Executive Officer Lieutenant Commander Tatsunosuke Ariazumi took command. He would guide I-401 through the difficult days ahead. Meanwhile, American forces were working to locate and secure Japanese submarines. The United States Navy had intelligence about the I-400 class submarines. They knew these vessels represented unique and valuable technology. Orders were issued to find and capture the submarines intact if possible. American commanders wanted to study these underwater aircraft carriers. The technology could have implications for future submarine warfare. Surface ships and patrol aircraft scoured the Pacific searching for Japanese submarines. Most Japanese submarine commanders complied with surrender orders promptly. They surfaced, displayed white flags, and waited for American forces. But locating submarines in the vast Pacific Ocean was still challenging. On August 29, 1945, American forces made contact with I-400. The submarine was approximately 500 miles east of Japan. It was flying a black flag of surrender, as ordered by Japanese command. The destroyer escort USS Bluegill approached the massive submarine cautiously. American sailors were astonished by the size of the vessel. It dwarfed any submarine they had ever seen. The cylindrical hangar running along the top of the hull was clearly visible. American officers immediately understood this was one of the aircraft-carrying submarines. A boarding party was sent across to take control of I-400. The Japanese crew offered no resistance and cooperated fully. Commander Nambu formally surrendered his vessel to the American captain. The Americans were eager to inspect this technological marvel. They found the submarine to be in excellent condition, despite months at sea. The hangar was empty, the aircraft having been jettisoned days earlier. But the catapult system and hangar mechanisms were intact. American engineers took detailed photographs and measurements. I-401 was located and captured shortly after I-400. The American destroyer USS Segundo made contact on August 29th. This submarine was also found east of Japan, flying the surrender flag. The capture of I-401 was complicated by the recent suicide of Captain Arizumi. The crew was still mourning their captain and struggling with the reality of defeat. But they followed orders and surrendered the submarine without incident. American boarding parties found I-401 to be nearly identical to I-400. The same massive size, the same aircraft hangar, the same sophisticated systems. Both submarines represented the pinnacle of Japanese submarine technology. I-402, the third submarine of the class, was captured separately. It had been converted to a fuel tanker and never carried aircraft operationally. The submarine was found near Japan and quickly secured by American forces. The smaller submarines, I-13 and I-14, had different fates. I-13 had been sunk by American destroyers in July 1945. I-14 survived and was captured, along with the I-400 class boats. All captured submarines were ordered to sail to Japan under American escort. Mixed crews of Japanese submariners and American sailors manned the vessels. The journey to Japan was tense, with former enemies working side by side. Communication was difficult due to language barriers, but both sides maintained professional conduct throughout the voyage. The submarines arrived at Sasebo Naval Base in southern Japan. American technical teams were waiting to conduct detailed inspections. Naval intelligence officers interviewed the Japanese crews extensively. They wanted to learn everything about the submarine's capabilities and intended missions. The Japanese submariners cooperated fully with these interrogations. Many were proud of their vessels and willing to explain the technology. American engineers were impressed by several aspects of the submarine design. The watertight aircraft hangar was a remarkable engineering achievement. The pressure seals and opening mechanism were sophisticated and reliable. The catapult system could launch a fully loaded bomber in seconds. The submarines had excellent range, capable of circumnavigating the globe. They could cruise at 16 knots on the surface and 6 knots submerged. Diving depth was approximately 330 feet, adequate for avoiding surface detection. The submarines were also well armed with 8 torpedo tubes. They carried 20 torpedoes and a deck gun for surface engagements. However, American engineers also identified significant weaknesses. The submarines were slow to dive, taking over a minute to submerge. This made them vulnerable to air attack if caught on the surface. The large size made them less maneuverable than smaller submarines. And the aircraft launching procedure left them exposed for extended periods. The Americans concluded that while impressive, the submarines had limited combat value. The concept of submarine-launched bombers was innovative but impractical. The aircraft had short range and limited bomb loads. They would be vulnerable to fighter interception and anti-aircraft fire, and recovering the aircraft at sea was nearly impossible. The submarines themselves would be better employed in traditional roles. This assessment reflected the American perspective on submarine warfare. The U.S. Navy had developed highly effective fleet submarines during the war. These submarines focused on attacking merchant shipping and warships. American submarines had devastated Japan's merchant fleet. By 1945, Japan was virtually cut off from overseas resources. This submarine blockade contributed significantly to Japan's defeat. The American submarine doctrine proved more effective than Japan's approach. Japan had focused submarines on attacking enemy warships. This doctrine wasted submarines on difficult targets. American submarines targeted vulnerable merchant ships with great success. The I-400 class submarines represented another Japanese miscalculation. Enormous resources were devoted to building 3 specialized submarines. These same resources could have built dozens of conventional submarines. Those submarines could have inflicted far more damage on Allied shipping. But Japanese military culture valued dramatic, decisive actions. The idea of bombing American cities appealed to this mindset. It offered the possibility of a knockout blow that would shock America into negotiating. This same thinking had motivated the attack on Pearl Harbor. Japanese leaders believed a dramatic strike could force American surrender, but they consistently underestimated American resolve and industrial capacity. The I-400 submarines were examined thoroughly by American experts in late 1945. Detailed reports were compiled on every aspect of their design and construction. Photographs documented the aircraft hangar, catapult, and internal systems. Some components were removed for further analysis in the United States. The submarines were also examined by Soviet representatives. The Soviet Union had joined the Allies against Japan in the war's final days. They demanded access to Japanese military technology as part of their war effort. American authorities were reluctant to share the submarines with the Soviets. The Cold War was already beginning, though it was not yet openly acknowledged. American military planners saw the Soviet Union as a potential future adversary. They did not want Soviet engineers studying advanced Japanese submarine technology. This created a diplomatic problem that needed resolution. The Soviet Union had been promised access to Japanese war material. Denying them access could create tensions in the nascent Allied occupation of Japan. American commanders faced a difficult decision. In early 1946, the decision was made to destroy the I-400 class submarines. This would prevent Soviet examination while fulfilling America's own intelligence needs. The official reason given was that the submarines were obsolete and not worth preserving. But the real motivation was denying this technology to the Soviets. The submarines were prepared for their final voyage. American crews would sail them out to sea for disposal. The Japanese crews had already been repatriated to civilian life. Many of them were devastated to learn their submarines would be destroyed. These vessels represented years of effort and the pinnacle of their navy's technology. But they had no say in the matter. Japan was now under occupation. I-400 was the first to be scuttled. On May 4, 1946, the submarine was towed to a location off Oahu, Hawaii. The position was approximately 20 miles southwest of Barber's Point. American sailors opened the submarine's sea valves and escaped to a waiting ship. Water flooded into I-400's compartments, and the massive submarine began to sink. It settled on the ocean floor at a depth of approximately 2,300 feet. I-401 met the same fate on May 31, 1946. It was scuttled in the same area as I-400. The submarine sank quickly, taking its secrets to the bottom of the Pacific. I-402 was scuttled on April 1, 1946. It joined its sister ships on the ocean floor near Hawaii. I-14, the smaller submarine that had worked with the I-400 class, was scuttled off Oahu on May 28, 1946. With these sinkings, the entire Japanese submarine aircraft carrier fleet was gone. The Soviet Union protested the destruction of these submarines. They accused the United States of violating agreements on sharing Japanese technology. But there was little they could do about it after the fact. The submarines were gone, beyond recovery with 1940s technology. The incident contributed to growing Soviet distrust of American intentions. For decades, the I-400 submarines rested on the ocean floor in obscurity. Their exact locations were classified by the U.S. Navy. The submarines became footnotes in histories of World War II. Most people were unaware that Japan had built underwater aircraft carriers. The few who knew about them considered them curiosities of little significance. But submarine technology continued to evolve in the post-war years. The development of nuclear propulsion revolutionized submarine warfare. The USS Nautilus, launched in 1954, could remain submerged indefinitely. Nuclear submarines made diesel-electric boats like the I-400 obsolete. The concept of submarine-launched aircraft never gained traction. Instead, submarines evolved to carry missiles. Cruise missiles and ballistic missiles provided far greater striking power. They could be launched from underwater, eliminating the need to surface, and they had far greater range and payload than any bomber aircraft. The modern ballistic missile submarine is the ultimate expression of submarine strategic power. These vessels carry enough nuclear weapons to devastate entire nations. They are the most powerful weapons platforms ever created. In a sense, they fulfill the vision that inspired the I-400 submarines, submarines capable of delivering strategic attacks from the sea. But the execution is vastly different from what Japanese designers envisioned. Interest in the I-400 submarines revived in the 21st century. Historians and submarine enthusiasts sought to learn more about these unique vessels. Veterans of the submarines were interviewed to preserve their memories. Some of these men were now in their 80s and 90s. They shared stories of life aboard the submarines and the confusion of the surrender. Their accounts provided valuable insights into this little-known chapter of the war. In 2005, a team from the University of Hawaii located the wreck of I-401. Using advanced sonar and underwater vehicles, they found the submarine. It was lying at a depth of 2,300 feet, just southwest of Oahu. The submarine was remarkably intact, despite decades on the ocean floor. The distinctive aircraft hangar was clearly visible in sonar images. Underwater photographs showed the massive size and unique design. The discovery generated significant media attention. Documentaries were produced about the I-400 submarines and their history. The public learned about these remarkable vessels for the first time. In 2013, the same team located the wreck of I-400. It was found near I-401 in similar condition. The two submarines had rested near each other for nearly 70 years. Further searches located I-14 and I-402 in subsequent years. All four submarines were designated as war graves. Though no one died when they were scuttled, they represent the memory of those who served. The wrecks are protected sites, not to be disturbed by salvagers. The discovery of these submarines provided valuable data for naval historians. Detailed surveys confirmed specifications that had been uncertain. The condition of the wrecks showed how well they were constructed, and seeing them helped people understand the scale and ambition of the design. The story of the I-400 submarines raises interesting questions. What if they had been deployed earlier in the war? Could they have changed the course of the Pacific conflict? Most historians believe the answer is no. The submarine's strategic impact would have been limited. 9 bombers could not inflict decisive damage on American infrastructure. Even successful attacks on the Panama Canal would have caused temporary disruption. American engineers would have repaired the damage quickly, and the psychological impact, while significant, would not have forced surrender. Americans had proven their determination after Pearl Harbor. Bomber attacks on U.S. cities would have stiffened resolve, not weakened it. The submarine's greatest value might have been as conventional attack boats. Their long range and large torpedo capacity made them dangerous raiders. They could have operated far from Japan, attacking Allied shipping. But the Japanese Navy chose to use them for the aircraft carrying mission. This reflects the Japanese preference for decisive, dramatic operations. The concept of slowly strangling the enemy through commerce raiding was less appealing. Yet that approach had worked brilliantly for American submarines against Japan. The I-400 submarines also demonstrate the limits of technological innovation. Japan created submarines that were marvels of engineering, but they appeared too late and in too few numbers to matter. Innovation must be timely to be effective in warfare, and it must be aligned with sound strategic thinking. Japan's war strategy was fundamentally flawed from the beginning. The nation lacked the resources to fight a prolonged war against America. Japanese leaders hoped for a quick victory that would force negotiations. When that didn't happen, they lacked a viable path to victory. The I-400 submarines were a last desperate attempt to achieve the impossible. They represented hope in a situation where hope was no longer realistic. For the men who served aboard these submarines, the experience was bittersweet. They had been selected for an elite mission aboard cutting-edge vessels, but they never got to demonstrate what the submarines could do. The war ended before Operation Hikari could be executed. Many of these men wondered for the rest of their lives what might have been. Could they have struck a blow that would have changed history? Or were they always destined to surrender without firing a shot? The capture of the I-400 submarines was ultimately anticlimactic. There was no dramatic battle or heroic last stand. The submarines simply surfaced and surrendered when ordered. This peaceful capture reflected the discipline of the Imperial Japanese Navy. When the Emperor ordered surrender, his forces obeyed. There were scattered incidents of resistance, but they were rare. Most Japanese military personnel accepted defeat with stoic resignation. The American handling of the captured submarines was pragmatic. They examined them thoroughly, learned what they could, then destroyed them. This prevented the technology from falling into Soviet hands. It was an early move in what would become the Cold War. The decision to scuttle the submarines has been debated by historians. Some argue that at least one should have been preserved for museums. The I-400 submarines were historically significant and unique. They represented a peak in World War II submarine development. Future generations would benefit from seeing these vessels firsthand. But in 1946, these considerations were secondary. The priority was preventing Soviet access to the technology. And there were practical concerns about maintaining such large, complex vessels. The Navy had limited interest in preserving obsolete enemy submarines. So the decision was made to send them to the bottom. Today, the I-400 submarines rest in peace beneath the Pacific. They are monuments to Japanese engineering and ambition. They represent both the creativity and the desperation of Japan's final war years. And they remind us that technological superiority alone cannot win wars. Strategy, resources, and timing matter just as much as innovation. The sarin aircraft that these submarines carried have also become historical curiosities. Only a few examples survive in museums today. The Smithsonian National Air and Space Museum has a restored sarin on display. It stands as a testament to the specialized aircraft designed for submarine operations. Visitors can see the folding wings and compact design that allowed hangar storage. The aircraft is beautiful in its own way, sleek and purposeful, but it also represents a path not taken in aviation history. Submarine-launched bombers never became a significant weapons category. Missiles proved far more effective for the same mission. The legacy of the I-400 submarines is complex. They were remarkable achievements in submarine design and construction. They pushed the boundaries of what was possible with 1940s technology. They demonstrated Japanese ingenuity and determination, but they also represented strategic miscalculation. Resources devoted to these submarines might have been better used elsewhere. Conventional submarines or other weapons could have had greater impact. The submarines also illustrate the fog of war and strategic planning. Japanese planners believed these submarines could change the war's trajectory. They invested enormous effort in their construction and deployment. But by the time they were ready, the strategic situation had evolved beyond them. This is a common pattern in military history. Weapons designed for one situation arrive when circumstances have changed. The key lesson is that military planning must be flexible and adaptive. Fixed plans become obsolete as wars evolve. For submarine historians, the I-400 class represents a fascinating what-if scenario. These were the largest submarines until nuclear boats appeared in the 1960s. They held that record for nearly 2 decades. Their size and capabilities were not exceeded until submarine technology was revolutionized. The I-400 submarines also influenced post-war submarine thinking. American and Soviet designers studied the captured data carefully. Some concepts from the I-400 design appeared in later submarines. The idea of large multi-mission submarines gained traction. Modern ballistic missile submarines share the I-400's strategic mission concept. They strike distant targets from the sea with devastating power. The execution is completely different, but the vision is similar. In Japan today, the I-400 submarines are remembered with mixed feelings. They represent both national pride in engineering achievement and the tragedy of a misguided war. Japanese naval historians have written extensively about the submarines. They analyze what went right and wrong with the design and deployment. Veterans of the submarines have been honored for their service, but there is also recognition that the mission was ultimately futile. The submarines could not have altered Japan's fate in 1945. The war was lost, regardless of what these remarkable vessels might have accomplished. For American veterans who participated in capturing the submarines, it was a unique experience. They had the opportunity to examine enemy technology up close. Many were impressed by the sophistication of the Japanese design. They interacted with Japanese submariners who had been enemies days before. These interactions were often surprisingly cordial. Both sides were professional sailors who respected each other's skills. The end of the war allowed for a degree of humanity that combat had suppressed. Some American sailors who boarded the submarines took photographs and souvenirs. These items have become valuable historical artifacts. They provide glimpses into the submarine's interiors and operations. Museums and collectors prize these materials today. The story of the I-400 submarines has been told in various media over the years. Books have been written examining their design, construction, and brief operational history. Documentaries have explored the submarines and their discovery on the ocean floor. The submarines have appeared in alternative history fiction. Authors have imagined scenarios where the submarines completed their missions. These stories explore how such attacks might have affected the war and post-war period. While fictional, they help us understand the submarine's potential impact. Scale model companies have produced kits of the I-400 submarines. Hobbyists can build detailed replicas, showing the unique features. These models help people visualize the submarine's size and configuration. The distinctive aircraft hangar makes them immediately recognizable. In the broader context of submarine warfare, the I-400 class represents an evolutionary dead end. No other nation built similar submarines after the war. The concept of submarine-launched bombers was abandoned. Missiles made aircraft obsolete for this mission. But the submarines demonstrated that ambitious concepts could be realized. Engineering challenges that seemed impossible could be overcome. This spirit of innovation influenced post-war submarine development. Designers became more willing to attempt radical new concepts. Nuclear propulsion, ballistic missiles, and advanced sensors followed. The I-400 submarines helped prove that submarine warfare had vast untapped potential. Today's naval forces rely heavily on submarines for both tactical and strategic missions. Attack submarines hunt enemy vessels and conduct reconnaissance. Ballistic missile submarines provide nuclear deterrence. Cruise missile submarines can strike land targets with precision. All of these roles were anticipated in some form by the I-400 concept. The submarines envisioned delivering strategic strikes from the sea. Modern submarines do exactly that, with far greater effectiveness. The capture of the I-400 submarines in 1945 marked the end of an era. It symbolized Japan's defeat and the end of World War II. But it also marked the beginning of new possibilities in submarine warfare. The knowledge gained from these submarines influenced the Cold War submarine race. Both superpowers developed increasingly sophisticated underwater fleets. The competition drove innovation at an unprecedented pace. Within 2 decades of the I-400's sinking, submarines had been completely transformed. For those who study military history, the I-400 submarines offer many lessons. They show the importance of aligning technology with strategy. They demonstrate that innovation without proper context has limited value. They illustrate how resource allocation decisions can affect war outcomes, and they remind us that even the most advanced weapons cannot overcome fundamental strategic disadvantages. Japan's decision to wage war against the United States was its fatal error. No amount of technological innovation could compensate for that mistake. The I-400 submarines, impressive as they were, could not change that reality. The human stories behind the submarines are equally compelling. The engineers who designed them worked under tremendous pressure. They solved complex technical problems with limited resources. Their achievement in creating these submarines was remarkable. The construction workers built the submarines in shipyards targeted by American bombers. They worked long hours under dangerous conditions to complete the vessels. The submariners trained intensively for missions they never completed. They faced the psychological challenge of surrendering without fighting. For men raised in Japan's warrior culture, this was deeply traumatic. The American sailors who captured and examined the submarines had their own experiences. They witnessed the fruits of Japanese engineering and determination. They interacted with former enemies in the strange calm after war's end. Many developed respect for the Japanese submariners and their vessels. These human connections across the divide of war are part of the submarine's legacy. As we reflect on the I-400 submarines today, we see them in multiple dimensions. They were engineering marvels that pushed the limits of submarine design. They were weapons of war that fortunately never fulfilled their destructive purpose. They were symbols of Japan's desperation in the war's final year, and they were harbingers of future submarine capabilities. The submarine's capture, rather than destruction in combat, was fortunate. It allowed them to be studied and understood. It prevented the loss of life that combat would have caused, and it enabled the peaceful transition from war to occupation. The submarines now rest on the Pacific floor as monuments to their era. They are reminders of World War II's final chapter. They testify to human ingenuity applied to warfare, and they stand as evidence of how quickly technology can become obsolete. The I-400 submarines were cutting edge in 1945. By 1946, they were already becoming historical relics. Nuclear propulsion and missile technology were emerging. Within a decade, submarines would be completely transformed. The pace of technological change in warfare can be breathtaking. This is another lesson from the I-400 story. Military planners must anticipate future developments, not just current capabilities. Weapons that seem revolutionary today may be obsolete tomorrow. The story of the I-400 submarines is ultimately a story of ambition and reality. Japan's ambition to strike the American mainland was audacious. The submarines represented a creative approach to achieving that goal. But the reality was that Japan's strategic position was hopeless by 1945. No single weapon system could reverse that situation. The submarines were captured before they could prove their worth in combat. We can only speculate about what they might have accomplished. But given the strategic realities of August 1945, they could not have changed history. The atomic bombs had already been dropped. The Soviet Union had entered the war against Japan. Japan's military was shattered, its cities destroyed, its people exhausted. Surrender was inevitable, with or without the I-400 submarines. Yet the submarines remain fascinating precisely because of their unrealized potential. They represent the path not taken, the battle never fought. They invite us to imagine alternative histories while recognizing actual outcomes. This is the story of the I-400 class submarines, the largest submarines ever built until the nuclear age, designed to carry bombers for attacks on the American mainland. Captured without firing a shot in combat, examined by their former enemies, then sent to the ocean floor. Rediscovered decades later, revealing their secrets to a new generation. These remarkable vessels bridge the gap between past and future. They show us what was possible with the technology of their time, and they hint at what would become possible in the years that followed. The I-400 submarines are monuments to human creativity applied to warfare. They remind us of both the brilliance and the tragedy of World War II, and they stand as testaments to a unique moment in naval history, when submarines became aircraft carriers and engineers dared to imagine attacking a continent from beneath the waves.